How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun, Daf 50 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, can you imagine? Already 50 daf into Masechta Zevachim. Sheesh. It's been kind of amazing. It's also been kind of intense. Anyways, friends, on Daf 50 of Masechta Zevachim, we continue our discussion of Lamed Min Halamed Bekodshim. Learning out something from something that's been learned out when it comes to Kodshim. Yesterday we began our discussion of this topic with Davar Lamed Behekish Eino Melamed Behekish Sheesh. Today we are going to really double down into this exploration. Maybe I'll even introduce this now. Oh boy. So I think kind of like the way that I was thinking to discuss this is this like kind of ABC framework. It's a kind of boring framework, but I think it's the best way I've thought to kind of be thinking about Davar Lamed Behekish. So meaning if you have A, B, C, so Davar Lamed Behekish, so if you have B, that's learned out from A via a Hekish, can B now teach about C via a Hekish? We were saying yesterday that the answer is no. We saw the Shita of Ravina, we saw the Shita of Rava. Anyway, so basically today, oh boy, we are going to be looking at Hekish, Kal V'chomer, Gezer Shava, and Binyanav. Sheesh, I don't even know how to describe it. Basically, we're going to go through each one of them, right? So yesterday, of course, we looked at Davar Lamed Behekish. Can it be Choser Melamed Behekish? We said no. Today we're going to explore, what about Davar Lamed Behekish, Choser Melamed B'Gezer Shava? What about Davar Melamed Behekish, Choser Melamed B'Kal V'chomer? What about Davar Lamed Behekish, Choser Melamed B'Binyanav? And then we move on to Gezer Shava. We do the same thing for Gezer Shava. We do the same thing for Kal V'chomer. We do the same thing for Binyanav. So basically we're going to have like 16 scenarios today. Sheesh, it's going to get tricky. It's going to be a hard daf. It's going to be a hard daf. Also, we have some work to do on daf Memtes Amud Beis. And I'm thinking just to bite the bullet and just go halfway through Nun Aleph Amud Aleph. It means tomorrow I think is going to be a really short daf. I think tomorrow is going to be a really short daf. I have a feeling today's going to be a really long daf. But anyways, that is the topic for Daf Nun of Masechta Zevachim. Lamed Min Halamed Bekodshim. Right? Learning out, right, can be learn out about, teach about C if it itself has already been learned out from A. And anyways, this is what we have ahead of us. Let's get started. Friends, we're going to begin on Daf Memtes Amud Beis 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 lines before it gets wide on Daf Memtes Amud Beis. At the 2 dots, there's a parenthesis there. Usually I wouldn't read these parentheses, but I think for today, it's slightly helpful. So if you look at the parentheses, it says, as I mentioned in the introduction, Hekish V'Gezer Shava Kal V'chomer. You can also add Binyanav Simin. Basically, as I mentioned a minute ago, we're going to go through each of these concepts, a Hekish, Gezer Shava, Kal V'chomer, Binyanav, and we're going to explore them in the context of Lamed Min Halamed Bekodshim, but I think the best thing for us at this point is just to get moving. Okay, so let us get started. So right after the 2 dots, Davar Lamed Behekish Ein Choser Melamed Behekish Midurav Miduravina. Okay, fine. That was 1 of 16, right? So yesterday, of course, we learned the Shita of Ravina, the Shita of Rava, that taught us that Davar Lamed Behekish. So again, if we use this like ABC framework, it's a very dry framework, it's a very technical framework, but I do think it's better to have it than not to have it. So let's just work with it. Let's just accept the fact that it's a boring framework. But if we just kind of accept that fact, I think it could be helpful. So basically, if B is learned from A, via a hekish, B cannot teach about C via a hekish. Okay, Imi Ravina, we saw, Ravina learned it out from Asher Mitzar, Rava learned it out from Parkoin Mashiach, Parim Davashal Tzibor, Seir Avodah Zarah. Okay. Davar Lamed Behekish, Maushi Lamed B'Gzeira Shava. If B is learned from A via a Hekish, can B now teach about C via a Gezerah Shava? Tashma, come in here. Reb Nosson ben Avtulmis, Omer says Reb Nosson ben Avtulmis, Minayin lefricha bibegadim shehi tahora. Okay, so we want to know, all right, what do we want to know? Who could tell me? If there's an outbreak of tsara'as on a garment, okay? If there's an outbreak of tsara'as on a garment, is the garment tahor or tameh? That's the question. You have a garment, it gets filled up with tsaras. Is that garment tahor or is it tameh? So this is going to be C. This is going to be C. This is what we're trying to learn out. Trying to learn this out, and we're going to learn it out from B, which is learned out from A. So, the answer is, so we said, so how do we know that it's tahora? That if you have a garment that's filled up with tsaras, it's tahor? Because Nemar karachas v'gabachas v'begadim, v'nemar karachas v'gabachas ba'adam. So that's a Gezerah Shava. That it says karachas v'gabachas by garments, and it also says karachas v'gabachas by people. Karachas v'gabachas by people is basically a bald head. It's talking about your tsaras of the head or tsaras of the face. That's gabachas. It's like the facial hair. So malahalam parach b'chulatar, afkan parach b'chulatar. So just like by karachas v'gabachas by a person, if a person's head is filled up with tsaras, so he will be tahor. So also if a person's clothing is filled up with tsaras, so he's also tahor. So the garment is tahor. And how do we know that if a person's head is filled up with tsaras, that he is tahor? Dichsiv meirosho ve'ad ragla via a hekish. That meirosho ve'ad ragla, we're comparing rosh, the head, ragla to the feet, kilu to the flesh, to the rest of the body. Ve'iskas rosho l'regel, so we're comparing the head to the foot. Maloholon, skip the next three words. Parach b'chulotar, just like by regel, i.e. by tsaras abosar, if a person is all filled up with tsaras, he's tahor. Afkan, also when it comes to tsaras of the head, skip the next three words. Parach b'chulo tahor, if he's all filled up with tsaras, he's tahor. So what did we see? So if we have the ABC framework, so we want to learn out about C. C is the garment that's filled up with tsaras. We want to figure that out. So now here's the thing. B is the tsaras of the head, and A is tsaras of the body. So B is learned out from A, right? Tsaras of the head, when it's filled up with tsaras, is tahor. That is learned out from A, which is when the whole body is filled up with tsaras, it's tahor. And that's through a hekish, right? Because it says rosho vad regel or whatever. So B is learned from A via hekish, and it's teaching about C, about the garment being filled up with tsaras, via a gezerah shava. So we see, and we're saying, how do we know that the garment is tahor? Well, basically from Davar Behekish, Chozer Melamed Be Gezerah Shava, that seems to be acceptable, at least in the context of tsaras. But now, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbi Yochanan, B'chol HaTorah Kula Lemeidin Lamed Milamed, Chutz Min HaKodshim She'ein Don Lamed Milamed. But now comes Rabbi Yochanan, he says, okay, that's all fine and good for tsaras. However, says Rabbi Yochanan, look, I'm going to read that again. B'chol HaTorah Kula, in all parts of the Torah, Lemeidin Lamed Milamed. Generally speaking, this is no problem. Right? We can learn out Lamed Milamed. We can learn out C from B. Right? So Lamed, C. Right? We can learn out something about C. From B, when B is itself learned out, is itself a Lamed. from A, right? So in general, b'chol Torah kula, no problem. Lamed, Min Halamed, that's no problem, like we saw with Saras. Chutz min hakodshim, but as a rule, this is not the case when it comes to kodshim. She'ein dan in lamed milamed, where we don't learn out lamed milamed. So now Rabbi Yochanan is going to prove that this same construct of davar lamed be'ekish chozer milamed be'gzer shava does not work when it comes to kodshim. The imkein lo yomar tzafona ba'asham, because if that were the case, if we can learn davar lamed be'ekish chozer milamed be'gzer shava, well then by asham we wouldn't have to write anything. The Torah wouldn't have to write anything about slaughtering the asham in the north of the Azar. We wouldn't have to say anything about slaughtering the asham in the north of the Azar. V'teisa b'gzer shava. And I'll just learn out from Gzer Shava, the Kodesh, Kodashim, Mechatos. That Chatos is B. Chatos is B. Chatos is learned out from Ola, which is A, from a Hekish, right? Because we saw Psukim yesterday, right, where we saw it in the context of Chatos, it says, Bimkom Shayish Chatos Ola. So we would learn out Chatos from Ola via a Hekish, and then we would learn Chatos to Asham via Gzer Shava. So Chatos would be Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Chozer Melamed to Asham via Gzer Shava. However, we don't do that. Instead, the Torah writes that an Asham needs to be slaughtered in the north of Dazara, because we don't say by Kodshim Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Chozer Melamed B'gzer Shava. Rather, Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Eino Chozer Melamed B'gzer Shava when it comes to Kodshim. Again, Dimkein La Yomar Tzafona Ba'asham, we wouldn't have to write anything about an Asham being slaughtered in the north. V'teisa B'gzer Shava, and we could just learn it out from Gzer Shava, the Kodesh Kodashim Michatos, a Gzer Shava of Kodesh Kodashim from Chatos. It says Kodesh Kodashim by Chatos, as well as by Asham. So the fact that by Asham it does say explicitly that it needs to be slaughtered in the north of the Azara, Lav Lemeimer, is that not to indicate the Davar Lamed Be'Hekish Ein Chozum Lam B'Gzer Shava. That clearly we're saying by Kodshim, by Korbanis, that Davar Lamed Be'Hekish Chatas, which is learned out from Ola Be'Hekish, the Chatas is unable to teach about the Asham via Gzer Shava. The Gemara suggests, well, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't prove that. Because Vidilma Mishum De'ika Lemifrach, because maybe you can ask, Malechatos Shke Mechaper Zalchai V'Kreisis. Maybe you'll say, wait, but maybe there's a reason why Chatas cannot teach to Asham, that Asham needs to be slaughtered in the north, because I'll say, look, Chatas is more stringent, and that's why it needs to be slaughtered Dafka in the north, because Chatas is Mechaper al Chai V'Kreisis, Masha Enkin, Asham is not Mechaper al Chai V'Kreisis. So we'll say that that kind of undoes the Gzer Shava. Don't learn out that Gzer Shava. Mufrach, we have a question on the Gzer Shava, that I can't learn Asham from Chatas, because Chatas is more stringent, because it's Mechaper for Chai V'Kreisus. But says the Gemara, Kodshim Yiseri Ksiva. The thing is, when you have a Gzer Shava that's mufne, when you have a Gzer Shava that is extra, that you have these extra words that are available specifically to be able to learn a Gzer Shava with them, that they're not needed for any other purpose other than to be used for a Gzer Shava, then you can't ask any questions on that Gzer Shava. That's what's called a Gzer Shava Mufne. That's a Gzer Shava that's completely available. And when you have a Gzer Shava that's completely available, there's no question in the world that you can ask on it. And that's the case here by Chatas and by Asham. There are, basically it already says Kodesh Kodashim both by Chatas and by Asham, but then it says it Nachamo, Kodesh Kodashim by Chatas and Asham. That makes it available specifically for this Gzer Shava. And therefore there's no asking questions, and therefore it should be a valid Gzer Shava, and therefore I should be able to say that Chatas is learned from Ola, that Chatas needs to be slaughtered in the north. Let's learn out Chatas to Asham via Gzera Shava, that Asham also needs to be slaughtered in the north, but we don't say that. Instead, the Torah explicitly writes that Asham needs to be slaughtered in the north as well, because we can't rely upon Davar Lamed Be Hekish, Chozar Melamed B'Gzera Shava. So there you have it. That when it comes to Kachim, we are not going. So even though by Tsaras we did say Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Chozar Melamed B'Gzera Shava, by Kachim we don't say Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Chozar Melamed B'Gzera Shava. Okay. He's drinking a little water. Okay. Moving on. So far we've learned about Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Eino Chozar Melamed Be'Hekish. Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Eino Chozar Melamed B'Gzera Shava. Moving on. Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Chozar Melamed B'Kav Chomer, B'Tana Dever B'Shmuel. That was easy. We saw on Daf Mem Aleph that the opinion of Tana Dever B'Shmuel is that Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Chozar Melamed B'Kav Chomer. So if B is learned from A via a Hekish, B could teach to C via a Kav Chomer. That was from Tana Dever B'Shmuel. The Gemara here doesn't get into it. You could look it up on Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. But basically that's the opinion of Tana Dever B'Shmuel, that Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Chozar Melamed B'Kav Chomer. We'll leave it at that and move on. Next. Davar Lamed Be'Hekish, Ma'usha Yilmod B'Binyanav. Okay, if B is learned from A via Hekish, can B teach to C by a binyan av? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Rabbi Yirmiyah, Lo lichtov tzafona be'osham, v'teisi me binyan av mechatos. Okay. Well, how about this? That chatas is B. Chatas is learned from Ola via a Hekish. They say that chatas needs to be slaughtered in the north. So let's say, by Osham, let's not write anything about Shechita in the north. And then let's just say a binyan av is a mematzinu. Mematzinu means that, well, we find, just like we find something, in this case, by chatas, let's just apply it to Osham as well. Mematzinu, just like we find by chatas that it needs to be slaughtered in the north. So let's also say by Osham that it needs to be slaughtered in the north. But the Torah doesn't write that. Instead, the Torah doesn't rely upon that. Rather, instead, the Torah explicitly writes by an Osham that needs to be slaughtered in the north. Rather, it must teach that Davar Lamed Be'Hekish Eino Chozar Melamed B'Binyanav. So again, Davar Lamed Be'Hekish Ma'ushi Lamed B'Binyanav. If B is learned from A via a Hekish, can it teach about C via Binyanav? Well, on Rabbi Yirmiyah, if that were the case, well then, Lo lichtov tzafona ba'asham, don't write anything about slaughtering the asham in the north of the Azar. V'teisi mi binyanav mechatos. And just say that just like chatas is slaughtered in the north, so is in asham. Ma'ilchza kosve. Why does the Torah explicitly say that an asham is slaughtered in the north of the Azar? Lav lememer, is it not to indicate to Davar Lamed Be'Hekish ein chozar melamed b'binyan av? Is that not an indication that something that's learned out via Hekish, that chatas, which is learned out from Ola via Hekish, that is slaughtered in the north, cannot teach about asham just as a mematzinu, that just like chatas is in the north, asham is also in the north? Rather, it explicitly writes that the asham is in the north, because we don't say Davar Lamed Be'Hekish chozar melamed b'binyan av. V'letaimich, but the Gemara says that's not really a good proof, because Teisi mi binyanav me'ola. Why not just learn out Osham directly from Ola? Like, why do we even need chatas? Just say that just like an Ola is slaughtered in the north, so too is the Osham. So Ella, my taima lo asi. Why don't we learn out Osham directly from Ola? Mishum dikal mifrach, because you can ask, Mala Olish ken kolil, because Ola is more stringent than Osham, because Ola is entirely burnt. Osham is not entirely burnt. So chatas nami. So the reason also why you inherently can't learn out chatas, really learn out Osham from chatas via a mematzinu, via binyanav. Mematzinu and binyanav are the same thing, is because ikal mifrach, you can ask malachatos shkim mechaperes al cheve kresos, that chatas is more stringent because it's mechaper al chayve kresos, which Osham is not, and therefore you have to write by Osham that it's slaughtered in the north, because you can't just simply learn it out from chatas, because chatas is more stringent because it's mechaper al chayve kresis. So again, we don't necessarily have a proof to say Dover Lamed Bekish Eino Melamed B'Binyanav. So the Gemara suggests 1 second. So we have 3 scenarios over here. We have Ola, we have Chatas, we have Asham. By all 3, we essentially write that they have to be slaughtered in the north of the Azar. Right? Ola, it says Ayerchem Mizbeach Tzafona. Then we juxtapose Chatas to Ola, Asham to Chatas and Ola. So why do we have to write by all 3, Ola, Chatas, Asham, that they are slaughtered in the north of the Azar? Why not just write in 2 out of the 3, and the third will be learned out from the fact that the first 2 have to be slaughtered in the north. Let's go weiter. Mehei Teisi, which where am I? Okay, which one will we learn it from? Now, okay, here we go. So for example, what if the Torah didn't write by Ola that it needs to be slaughtered in the north? Rather, the Torah wrote by Chatas and by Asham that they need to be slaughtered in the north. And let's say that just like Chatas and Asham need to be slaughtered in the north, so too Ola. Well, no, you wouldn't, because Malahanach, I could argue, okay, fine, Chatas and Asham need to be slaughtered in the north. Shekein Mechaprin, because Chatas and Asham are Mechaper. They atone. Ola doesn't atone. I mean, technically, it's essay, but that's a whole different story. Okay, how about this? Write Tzafon, write that the Ola and the Asham need to be slaughtered in the north. And I'll say, just like Ola and Asham are slaughtered in the north, so too is the Chatas. But that wouldn't work, because Malahanach, when it comes to Ola and Asham, Shekein Zcharim. In Ola and in Asham are both male, whereas Chatas, of course, is Kispa V'Seira. It's different. It's female. Lo nichtov ba'Asham. Okay, don't write anything about the north from Asham. By Asham V'Teisi Me'anach, learn it out from Chatas and Ola. Malanach Shekein Yeshna B'Tzibur K'B'Yochid. Right, you have Ola's Tzibur, right, the Korban Talmud, Shel Shachar and Korban Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim is a Korban Ola. A Chatas, right, for example, on Rosh Chodesh, right, Siriizim L'Chatas. So Ola and Chatas you can have as communal offerings, Masha Enkein by Asham. And therefore you can't learn out Asham from Chatas and Ola. So we can't just write Safon by 2 out of 3 and learn out the third from the other 2. Therefore, we need to write Safon that the Korban needs to be slaughtered in the north by Asham, by Chatas, by Ola, by all 3 of them. We tried to prove Dover Lamed Bekish Eino Melamed B'Binyanav, but we couldn't quite prove that. Okay, that was a run through of Hekish. We are now going to move on to Gezeirah Shavit. All right, moving on. Dover Lamed B'Gezeirah Shavit Ma'ushilam Bekish. All right, now again by Gezeirah Shavit. Now we got to look out. Dover Lamed B'Gezeirah Shavit Ma'ushilam Bekish. Ma'ushilam B'Gezeirah Shavit Ma'ushilam B'Kavachom Ma'ushilam B'Binyanav. Here we go. So Dover, something that's learned up from, if B is learned from A via Gezeirah Shavit, can it teach about C via a Hekish? Amar Puppet says of Puppet, well, V'zos Tia Zeva V'zos Toras Zevach HaShlomim V'gomer Im Al Toda L'man Toda Shabo Min HaMaiser. Okay. Midashchan Shlomim Dosim MiMaiser. From the fact that we find, okay, Sham Gufay Minal and Tichsev, Sham. Okay. So, okay. C over here, C is Toda, B is Shlamim. So the Shaila is, can a Korban Toda be purchased from Kesef Meiser Sheni? Most Kesef Meiser Sheni, right? So if you have Meiser Sheni, okay, and you redeem it onto money, and you bring that money to Yerushalayim, the question is, can you use the Meiser Sheni money to buy a Korban Toda? Korban Toda is C, and it's learned out from Shlomim, which is B, via a Hekish. So again, Davar Lamed b'Gzeir Shava, something that's learned out from Gzeir Shava, so in this case, that's B, right? So that's the Shlomim, as we're going to see. Shlomim is learned that it can be purchased with Kesef Meiser Sheni. That is learned from Gzeir Shava. Mausha Yilamed beHekish, can Meiser Sheni now teach about Toda via a Hekish? No, what? No. Can Shlomim now teach about Toda via a Hekish? Amar Papa says a Papa. Now, here's what it says by, this is the Hekish between Shlomim and Toda. V'zos Toras Zevach Ashlamim v'Gomer. This is the Torah of the Zevach Hashlamim, and then it says in the next pasuk, Im al Toda, and then it talks about Toda. So we have Toda juxtaposed to Shlamim. So Lamanu l'Toda Shabbat min ha'Meiser, mida'ash chon Shlamim dasu mi Meiser. So we see that Toda can be purchased using Kesef Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim. Right? Since we know that Shlamim, you can purchase a Korban Shlamim with Kesef Meiser Sheni, and Toda is juxtaposed to Shlamim, so Toda can also be purchased with Kesef Meiser Sheni. So we learned that via a Hekish. Now Shlamim Gufayu Minol, and how do we know that Shlamim can be purchased with Kesef Meiser Sheni? Dichsiv Sham Sham. It says Sham by Shlamim. What does it say? It says V'zavachta Shlamim v'achalta Sham. Samachta f'nei Hashem Elokechem. By Meiser Sheni it says V'achalta f'nei Hashem Elokechem b'makom Meshivcha l'shakin shmo Sham. Meiser Dugan Chatirosha, etc. So basically, Shlamim, which is B, is learned from Meiser Sheni, which is A, via Gzeir Shava of Sham Sham. And we're saying, and then Shlamim is teaching about Toda, which is C, via a Hekish. So we see that even though Rabbi Yochanan, as a general rule, has his principle that there's no Lamed min Halamed be Kodshim, however, we want to say that this is an exception to the rule. That here we have Shlamim, which is learned out from Meiser Sheni via a Gzeir Shava, is now teaching about Toda via a Hekish. But says Marzutra Breder of Mari to Ravina, maybe this is not a scenario of Lamed min Halamed Bekachim, because Meiser Dagon Chulin Ba'alma Hu. That Meiser Sheni is really just considered Chulin, right? Anybody could technically eat it. So therefore we want to say that it is Chulin, and it's not necessarily a scenario of Lamed min Halamed Bekachim, because the Meiser would be considered Chulin. On my lay, Ravina responds to who's here? To Marzutra Breder of Mari. Amalei Omar Omra Lamed Kodesh and Melamed Kodesh. What? One second. When Rabbi Yochanan says Lamed min Halamed Bekachim, does that mean that everything needs to be Kodshim? That the Lamed is Kodesh and the Melamed is also Kodesh? Right? Does the Lamed, which in this case is Shlamim, and the Melamed, which is Meiser Sheni, everything needs to be Kodesh in order for it to be considered Lamed min Halamed be Kodesh? No, it's enough if even just the Shlamim, of course, is Kodshim. That would be enough to be considered Lamed min Halamed be Kodshim. And therefore, when Rabbi Yochanan says that Ein Lamedin Lamed min Halamed be Kodshim, it would even apply to a scenario where only, let's say, the B is Kodshim, even though A is not. And we see here, nonetheless, that this seems to be an exception to the rule, because we have Shlamim, which is learned out from Meiser Sheni via a Gzeir Shava, and it is in fact teaching about Shlamim be Hekish. Okay, fine. Now this is important, because it's going to come up later. Later we're going to be referencing Davar Lamed B'Gzeira Shava, Melamed Behekish via Rav Papa. Right? When we see this later on, it's going to come up. We're going to reference this. When we say later on, Davar Lamed B'Gzeira Shava, Chozer Melamed Behekish, Midar Rav Papa, that is this. It's talking about Shlamim and Toda. Also, when we see Davar Lamed Behekish, Einum Lamed B'Gzeira Shava, from Rabbi Yochanan, that was from before, that was basically from the Banu Memtes Amid Beis. Okay. We're also going to see Davar Lamed Behekish, Chozim Lamed Kavachomer from Tanit Rabbi Shmuel, as we've already seen at the top of Nun. But we're going to be referencing these different scenarios that as we learn them. Okay. Moving on. So we just learned Davar Lamed Behekish, Davar Lamed B'Gzeira Shava, Chozim Lamed Behekish. Now we're going to get to Davar Lamed B'Gzeira Shava, Chozim Lamed B'Gzeira Shava. If B is learned from A via Gzeira Shava, can B now teach about C via Gzeira Shava? So Davar Lamed B'Gzeira Shava, Malashi Lamed B'Gzeira Shava, Amar Rami Bar Chama, says Rami Bar Chama, Tanya, we learn in a brisa. Oh, okay. Chaver, let us read this pasuk. Let us read, it's actually 2 psukim. Here we go. I'm going to read some psukim. V'zos Torah Zevach HaShlomim Asher Yakriv L'Hashem. Okay, this is the Torah of Shlomim. Now, Im Al Toda Yakrivenu. So if we're talking about a korban Toda, okay, fine. V'hikriv Al Zevach HaToda. So of course, a korban Toda, together with the korban Toda, are 4 types of breads. Now, 3 of them are actually matzahs, only 1 of them is actually chametz. But anyways, there's 4 types of breads that are brought with, or 4 types of loaves that are brought with a korban toda. Now, we say, chalos matzahs b'luz b'shemen. So one type, so we're going to go through the 3 types of matzah types, the 3 unleavened types right now. So there's chalos matzahs b'luz b'shemen, chalas that are mixed with oil. Urikike matzahs mishuchim b'shemen, and rikikin. V'soles murbeches and revuchas chalos belulos b'shemen. Okay, so you have chalos, you have rikikin, and you have revuchin. What we want to learn is, so C is rikikin. Rikikin is C. We want to try to figure out, do rikikin need to be from soles? Do rikikin need to be made from soles, or can you use kemach? Soles is a finer flour than kemach. So rikikin is C. Chalas are B. Revuchin are A. So by revuchin, it says explicitly soles, right? What did we just say? I'm just going to focus on these psukim before getting into the Gemara. I'm going to focus on these. I'm going to learn. Let's just look at these psukim first. So by revuchin, it said v'soles murbeches. So by revuchin, it says explicitly that it needs to be soles. So by revuchin, it says v'soles murbeches chalos plus b'shemen, and chalas is B, because obviously it says chala by chalas, and it says chalas by revuchin, right? It said soles murbeches chalos plus b'shemen. So just like by revuchin it says soles, so also the chalas need to be soles. So we're learning out soles, which is B, via gzeir. So we're learning out chalas, which is B, via gzeir shava from revuchin, which is A, that by chalas you also need soles. And then how do we know that rikikin, which is C, also needs soles? Now we're going to learn gzeir shava because it says chalos matzos, and it says rikike matzos. So it says matzos both by chalas and by rikikin. So just like chalas are soles, rikikin are also soles. So we have chalas, which are B, which was learned out from gzeir shava from revuchin, which is A, that chalas need to be soles. And we're saying now that chalas is now teaching about rikikin, which is C, that the rikikin also by gzeir shava of matzos, that rikikin need to be made from soles as well. So now let's look at this inside. So again, davar lamed b'gzeir shava mal shelamed b'gzeir shava. If B is learned from A via gzeir shava, can B now teach about C via gzeir shava? Well, apparently so. Tanya, we're learning about it says soles morbeches, that by revuchin, soles morbeches. We say that revuchin need to be soles. Lamana revucha shabas soles. So revuchin, right? These are right. Okay, these are different types of breads. Minachos, mincha breads. It needs to be soles. Now, chalos minayin. How do you know that chalos also need to be soles? Via a, so chalos is B. Via a gezer shava. Tamilom chalos. It says soles morbeches chalos, and also by chalos, of course, it says chalos. So therefore, just like revuchin are soles, also chalos is soles. Rikikin minayin. And how do you know about rikikin, which is C, that rikikin also are soles? Talmud Omer matzos. It says matzos by chalas and matzos by rikikin. So there you go. So apparently, even though we're talking about kodshim, apparently when it comes to gzera shava, right, davalom b'gzera shava, milamed b'gzera shava, it sounds like that is in fact the case, that davalom b'gzera shava, milamed b'gzera shava. Amalei Ravina. But Ravina, however, says to Rami Bar Chama. So there's a different gears that says Rava actually. I'm going to Rava Rami Bar Chama. I actually prefer that. Why? Because we're going to see in a minute, it's going to say Elo Amar Rava. So honestly, it's nice if it says Rava asks the questions and then Rava gives the answer. But also often we find that Rava argues with Rami Bar Chama. Interesting. I think Rava and Rami Bar Chama were both married to the same daughter of Rav Chizda, I believe. I think Rami Bar Chama died and then Rava married her. Anyways, so Amalei Rava says to Rami Bar Chama, Mimai de matzis michalis gomer. But one second. How do you know that rikikin, which is C, how do we know that rikikin are soles? How do you know that that's because we learn out from Gzera Shava from chalas, which we learn out from Gzera Shava from revuchin? To teach Davlam be Gzer Shava Chosam Lam Gzer Shava, but maybe Duma Mimai Fasoner Gomer. Maybe Rikikin are learned directly from my Fasoner. What does the pasuk say by my Fasoner? I'm reading the pasuk now. V'chi Sikrav Korban my Fasoner, Korban Mincha my Fasoner, Soles. So it says Soles. Chalos Matzos. Bluz Bashemin, it said, Urkike matzos b'shuchim Bashemin. So it says, I guess, probably Gzer Shava Rikikin, or at least matzos. We can learn Gzer Shava from Rikik, right, for Rikikin directly from a Korban Mincha Mai Fesoner. That over there it says Solis. So maybe that's a Gzer Shava that we're learning directly. So you don't need to learn Rikikin via Gzer Shava from Chala, which is learned from Chalos, which are learned from Gzer Shava from Revuchin. Maybe Rikikin could just be learned directly by Gzer Shava from my Fesoner to say that it needs to be solos, in which case it is not a proof for Davalam Gzer Shava, Mechozum Lam Gzer Shava. Elo Amar Rava, rather says Rava, Tani, we're learning a Brayse, Vikirbo Ufirsho Votzi. It says by a Parkoin Mashiach. It says by Parkoin Mashiach, the Kirbar Ufirsho, its intestines and its dung that's in its intestines. I don't know what you would call dung in its intestines. I feel like, I don't know. Let's just call it the waste that's in the intestines. V'hotzi, and it will be taken out to the Beis Hadeshin. Okay, so the fact that it says v'kirbo ufirsho, right? V'hotzi, that you're taking everything out whole, right? Because it says v'hotzi, right? Since you're taking everything out, you can't. What does the pasuk say? 1 second. V'hotzi has kol par mechutz machne. Right, you have to take all of it out. In order to be able to take all of it out, it would have to be shalom. It would have to be whole, right? Because if you already had cut it up into little pieces, into a bunch of pieces, how are you going to take it out all at once? The fact that you're taking it out all at once, it must be that the carcass, I guess, is still whole. Okay. That you take out the parka and Mashiach after it's been slaughtered, and the emurin are burnt in the mizbeach chitzon. The rest of the cow is taken out to the Beis Hadeshin while it is still whole. Is it possible you will also burn it when it is whole without cutting it up into pieces? Nemarkan rosha uchrav. Well, it says by parka and Mashiach rosha uchrav. V'nemer lahalon, and it says by olas. It says by ola, either olas atzon or olas bakar. It says by korban ola, rosha uchrav as well. Malaholon aideni tuach, just like by korban ola, you're cutting it up into pieces. Afkan aideni tuach. So also by parka Mashiach, we're talking about where it's cut up into pieces. So we learn out by Gzera Shava between parka and Mashiach and ola that the parka Mashiach is cut up into pieces before it's burnt. Now when it comes to an ola is flayed the right word? An ola is flayed of its hide before it is burnt. So maybe the parka Mashiach is also flayed. Tamlomar, the pasuk says, "V'kirbo ufirsho," its intestines and its waste. You're not going to take the waste out of the intestines. That would not be very mechubad to have a korban and it just smells very foul because the waste has been taken out of the intestines. So my Talmud, how does V'kirbo ufirsho teach that the hide of the korban remains on it when it's burnt? So Amr Papa says, Kshem shepersho V'kirbo kach b'sar ba'oro. Well, just like we keep the waste in the intestines, we don't take out the waste because that would smell very bad. That would smell bad. So similarly, kach b'sar ba'oro, also the meat of the parka Mashiach remains in the hide of the animal while it is burnt. So you cut it up into pieces, but keep the hide on it. Okay, fine. Now, the Tani we learn in the Brisa, Rebbe Omer says, Rebbe, Nemar kan or uvasar uferish. So it says by so this is talking about the parvisar shalom HaKippur. Okay. So where am I? So Tani Rebbe Omer says, Rebbe Nemar kan, it says by the parvisar shalom HaKippurim or uvasar uferish. Okay. Hide, meat, waste. It says by the parka Mashiach or uvasar uferish. Malalan aidei nituach shelo be'evshit. So that is learned out from nituach that it's cut up shelo be'evshit, but the hide remains on. Afkan also by the parka Yom Kippurim aidei nituach shelo be'evshit, it is cut up into pieces but not flayed. No. So what just happened? So what's A, B, and C? C is the parvisar Yom Kippurim that we just learned about. B is the parka and Mashiach. A is the korban ola. So we learned B from A. We learned parka and Mashiach from the korban ola that it is cut up into pieces. Now by parka and Mashiach, we had said that you keep the hide on it because that's learned out from the fact that we leave the dung in the intestines. But we learned out to parka and Mashiach from korban ola that it is first cut up into pieces before it is burnt, and that's learned out from the Gzera Shava of Kirbo Uchrav. And now we learn out through another Gzera Shava from parka and Mashiach to parvisar Yom Kippurim, that the parvisar Yom Kippurim, which is C, is going to be burnt when it is cut up. But that is ultimately learned out from A. So parka and Mashiach, which is B, was learned from Ola, which is A, so via Gzera Shava, which is then now B. Parka and Mashiach is now teaching about C, about parvisar Yom Kippurim, also via Gzera Shava, that the parvisar Yom Kippurim is burnt while it is, when it is cut up into pieces. So we see that this is an exception to Reb Yochanan's principle, and that davar lamed be'gzeira shava, chozer melamed be'gzeira shava. Moving on. Davar lamed be'gzeira shava, ma'ushi lamed be'kal v'chomer. Okay, so this is not from Gzeir Shava. Can it now teach if B is learned from A via Gzeir Shava? Can B teach about C via Kal V'chomer? The answer is Kal V'chomer. Now, Chaver, remember this. I need to drink a stick of water. 1 second. Now, Chaver, remember this. Remember this. Davar lamed b'Gzeir Shava, chozer u'melamed b'Kal V'chomer. This is learnt via a Kal V'chomer. We'll see what the Kal V'chomer is right now. But this concept of Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Chozer Melamed B'Kal V'chomer is itself learned out from a Kal V'chomer. It's going to be later. It's going to be relevant later on. However, now, at this point, until really the end of the Amud, or towards the end of the Amud, we are going to be answering some of these questions. For example, now, Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Chozer Melamed B'Kal V'chomer, yes or no? We're saying, well, I'll answer that by making a Kal V'chomer. So we're going to have several of these Kal V'chomers. Kal V'chomers, of course, can get a little tricky. But we're going to now have some of these, we're going to now be trying to answer some of these questions that we have, some of these analyses, using a Kal V'chomer. So now, when it comes to Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Melamed B'Kal V'chomer, the answer is, well, I'll tell you, a Kal V'chomer. Uma hekish she'eino melamed behekish imidrava midravina. We had said already yesterday, Davar lamed behekish eino melamed behekish. We saw the opinion of Vina, we saw the opinion of Rava. Melamed b'Kal V'chomer. Midatanat v'Rei Bishmal. From Tanat v'Rei Bishmal. Okay. Gzeir Shava. Hamelamedes be'ekes midrab papa. We said, Davar lamed b'Gzeir Shava melamed be'ekish. That was a papa with the shlomim and the toda. And odin shetulamed b'Kal V'chomer. So Davar lamed be'Gzeir Shava should learn out b'Kal V'chomer. I'm going to read that again, and I'm going to strip out. As I read it again, I'm going to strip out Rava, Ravina, Tanat v'Rei Bishmael, Rav Papa. I'm going to strip all that out so we can just focus on the Kal V'chomer. So again. Davar lamed b'Gzeir Shava ma'ushi lamed b'Kal V'chomer. So Kal V'chomer. Uma hekish she'eno melamed behekish melamed b'Kal V'chomer. Right, so hekish is not melamed. Right. Davar lamed behekish eno melamed behekish, but Davar lamed behekish melamed b'Kal V'chomer. Well then, Gzeir Shava melamed is behekish, right? Davar melamed b'Gzeir Shava melamed behekish. Well then, certainly, Davar lamed b'Gzeir Shava melamed b'Kal V'chomer. Sheesh, it's a little tricky. But again, basically, if you have Davar lamed behekish, eino melamed behekish, and yet when it comes to Gzeir Shava, Davar lamed b'Gzeir Shava melamed behekish. So if you have Davar lamed behekish, eino melamed behekish, and yet Davar lamed behekish melamed b'Kal V'chomer, certainly then if you have Gzeir Shava, or Davar lamed Gzeir Shava, which is melamed behekish, well then certainly Davar lamed Gzeir Shava melamed b'Kal V'chomer. Okay, fine. So this is all fine and good if you hold like Rav Papa, right? We had asked Akasha on Rav Papa that isn't really Kachim, since Rav Papa was talking about Meiser Sheni, Kesef Meiser Sheni. We argued that Kesef Meiser Sheni really that's really considered Chulin. Look, so if you hold like Rav Papa, great. So then you have the Gzeir Shava, because part of the Gzeir Shava was based on Davar lamed Gzeir Shava. I'm sorry, not the Gzeir Shava, the Kal V'chomer, right? Part of the Kal V'chomer relied on Davar lamed b'Gzeir Shava melamed behekish like Rav Papa. But if you don't hold of Rav Papa and you don't have the Davar lamed b'Gzeir Shava melamed behekish piece, so leman delays they do Rav Papa ma'ikal lemeimar. But if you don't hold of Rav Papa, then what? Ela Kal V'chomer. Okay, rather than learn the following Kal V'chomer. Umahekish she'ein melamed behekish imidrav midravina melamed b'Kal V'chomer b'Tanat v'Rei Bishmal. Gzeir Shava hamelamedes b'gzeir shava chaverta midurabim b'chama eno din shetlamed b'kal v'chomer. Okay. That basically it's comparing Davar Lamed Behekish Eno Melamed Behekish to Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava Melamed B'Gzeir Shava. Right? We learned from Rami Bar Chama Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava Melamed B'Gzeir Shava. That was with the Menachos, right? With the Rekikin and the Revuchin and the Chalas. Ravid asked the question of Bar Chama, but let's not worry about that. So anyways, the Kal V'chomer is now the following. Again, what's the question? The question is, Davar, I told you, Chevy, this is a little tricky. It's hard. Kal V'chomers are like the sleeper. I feel like Kal V'chomer is like the sleeper in Shas. It doesn't feel like a Kal V'chomer should be hard, right? It's like my 4th grade Rebbe would say, if I could lift 100 pounds, I could lift 50 pounds. Okay, that's a very easy Kal V'chomer. But Kal V'chomers really do get hard. Like right now, it's just very difficult to explain this Kal V'chomer. It's a mess. But anyways, the Kal V'chomer is this. Remember, what are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out whether we could say Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava Melamed B'Kal V'chomer. And what we want to say is yes. How do we know that? Via Kal V'chomer. What's the Kal V'chomer? Well, if you look at Hekish, Davar Lamed B'Hekish Eno Melamed B'Hekish. Now, when we look at Gzeir Shava, what would be the equivalent by Gzeir Shava? Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Melamed B'Gzeir Shava, right? We're comparing Davar Lamed B'Hekish, Melamed B'Hekish. So Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Melamed B'Gzeir Shava. Kilu, something that's learned, right? Meaning we're talking about itself, right? I don't even know how to explain it. Like Davar Lamed B'Hekish, Melamed B'Hekish, as opposed to like Davar Lamed B'Hekish, Melamed B'Kal V'chomer, or Melamed B'Gzeir Shava, or Melamed B'Binyanav. Kilu, we're talking about Davar Lamed B'Hekish, Melamed B'Hekish. The equivalent by Gzeir Shava would be Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Melamed B'Gzeir Shava. So now, when it comes to Hekish, we say Davar Lamed B'Hekish, Eino Melamed B'Hekish, and yet Davar Lamed B'Hekish, Melamed B'Kal V'chomer. Well then, when it comes to Gzeir Shava, where Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Melamed B'Gzeir Shava, certainly then Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Melamed B'Kal V'chomer. Okay. I guess I'll read it again inside, though I'm not sure it's necessarily going to help. Kal V'chomer, U'mahekish, I backed up a few lines. U'mahekish, she'ein Melamed B'Hekish, Melamed B'Kal V'chomer, Mitan Tever Bishmo. Gzeir Shava hamelamedes b'Gzeir Shava chaverta midam b'choma. Eno din shetlamed b'Kal V'chomer. Okay, and finally, Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava ma'ushi lamed b'Binyanav. Take. If B is learned from A via Gzeir Shava, can it teach about C in a Binyanav? We say, let's go weiter. Okay, Chevra, we are halfway through. How far? Oh gosh, I feel like, oh no, are we already at an hour? Chevra, I think we're already at an hour. Oh boy. If we're already at an hour, we might already be at an hour. If we're already at an hour, we're only halfway through. Could this be the first 2-hour daf? Anyways, I don't know. I think tomorrow is going to be a shorter daf. So if you want, you can pause at some point. But anyways, okay. So we've gone through all of the hekishes. We've gone through all the Gzeir Shavas. Now we are moving on to Kal V'chomer. Okay. Davar Lamed B'Kal V'chomer, Ma'ushi Lamed B'Hekish. All right. If B is learned from A via Kal V'chomer, can B teach about C via A Hekish? Right? Davar Lamed B'Kal V'chomer, Ma'ushi Lamed B'Hekish. Kal V'chomer. Okay. Uma Gzeir Shava she'eina lemeda be'akesha midur b'yechanan. Right, we had learned on Mem Tesam Beis all the way at the bottom. Davar Lamed B'Hekish eino melamed b'Gzeir Shava, and yet melamed B'Hekish midur apope. Right, Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava melamed B'Hekish. So again, Davar Lamed B'Hekish eino melamed B'Gzeir Shava. But Davar Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Melamed B'Hekish. Kal V'chomer Lamed B'Hekish, in the time of Rabbi Shmuel, right? Davar Lamed B'Hekish, Melamed B'Kal V'chomer, Eno Din Shelamed B'Hekish. certainly then it should be Melamed Behekish, right? Basically, if Davar Lamed Behekish Eino Melamed B'Gzeir Shava, and yet Davar Lamed Behekish Melamed B'Kal V'Chomer, so did I just lose it? I lost it. Where are we? I'm going to read it again. Oh, okay, fine. Okay. Oh, sheesh. Right, so you have Gzer, right? Davar Lamed Big Hekish, Eino Melamed B'Gzer Shava. And yet, right, Davar Lamed Behekish, Eino Melamed B'Gzer Shava. Davar Lamed B'Gzer Shava, Melamed Behekish. Yeah, okay, exactly. Davar Lamed Be, I'm going to say it again. Davar Lamed Behekish, Eino Melamed B'Gzer Shava. Davar Lamed B'Gzer Shava, Melamed Behekish. Now, when it comes to Kal V'Chomer, Davar Lamed Behekish, Melamed B'Kal V'Chomer, certainly then Davar Melamed B'Kal V'Chomer should be Melamed Behekish. Yeah. Oh, sheesh. My brain is starting to break. Dag nabbit. Brain, don't break. So that was the Kal V'Chomer. I'm going to say it again. If we have Davar Lamed Behekish, Eino Melamed B'Gzer Shava. Okay. Now Davar Lamed B'Gzer Shava, Melamed Behekish. Okay. Now if you have Davar Lamed Behekish, Melamed B'Kal V'Chomer, certainly then Davar Lamed B'Kal V'Chomer, Melamed Behekish. Oh, my brain is broken. I think that was correct. My brain is so broken. Wait, but why does that make sense? Davar Lamed Behekish is not Melamed. Davar Lamed Behekish is not Melamed B'Gzer Shava. Yet Davar Lamed B'Gzer Shava is Melamed Behekish. Now you have, okay, so meaning if you're looking at Gzer Shava, right, so you have Davar Lamed Behekish, Eino Melamed B'Gzer Shava, yet Davar Lamed B'Gzer Shava, Melamed Behekish. So if you look at Kal V'Chomer, Davar Lamed Behekish, Melamed B'Kal V'Chomer, then certainly Davar Lamed B'Kal V'Chomer is Melamed. Because if you start with Hekish as a starting point, and you say, well, Davar Lamed Behekish is not Melamed B'Gzer Shava, but then when you use Gzer Shava as a starting point, it is Melamed Behekish. So then certainly when you have Davar Lamed Behekish as a starting point, Melamed B'Kal V'Chomer. Now when you have Kal V'Chomer starting as the starting point for Hekish, Davar Lamed Behekish, Davar Lamed B'Kal V'Chomer, Melamed Behekish. Wow. My brain is starting to mush. Let's read it again. Davar Lamed B'Kal V'Chomer, Ma'osh Lamed Behekish. So if you have Davar Lamed B'Kal V'Chomer, can it be Melamed Behekish? I'm going to read it. Now I'm going to read it again. I'm going to strip out the Ravinas and the thises and the that's. Now, Kal V'Chomer. Uma Gzer Shava. She'ena Lemeda Be'akesha. Melamed Behekish. Right? So it's not Lamed Behekish, but it's Melamed Behekish. Kal V'Chomer. Halamed Behekish. Eino din she'yelamed Behekish. Hanicha Leman De'isle De'apapa. Well, that works if you hold the Rav Papa, right? Because that was based on assuming Davar Lamed Gzer Shava Melamed Behekish, which is Rav Papa. But Elaman De'leisle De'apapa. If you don't hold the Rav Papa, Ma'ikal Meimer, take. Okay, fine. Now, Davar Lamed B'Kal V'Chomer, Ma'osh Lamed B'Gzer Shava, Kal V'Chomer. Woo. So Davar Lamed B'Kal V'Chomer, Ma'osh Lamed B'Gzer Shava. Okay, so if B is learned from A via Kal V'Chomer, can B teach about C via Gzer Shava? Wow. Kal V'Chomer. Uma Gzer Shava. She'ena Lemeda Be'akesha Mid Rabbi Yochanan. Right? Davar Lamed Be'akesh Eino Melamed B'Gzer Shava. Milamed B'Gzer Shava. And yet, Midrabim by Chama. Right? Davar Lamed B'Gzer Shava. Wow, my brain is really starting to unravel. I'm going to read that again. Now, Kal V'Chomer, Ma Gzer Shava, She'ena Lemeda Be'akesha, Mid Rabbi Yochanan, Milamed B'Gzer Shava, Midrabim by Chama, Gzer Shava is Milamed B'Gzer Shava. Kal V'Chomer, Halamed Be'akesh, Mid Tana Rabbi Shmuel, Eino din She'talamed B'Gzer Shava. I'm going to read it again, stripping out the Rambam by Chamas and all that stuff, and just so we can get the kind of Kal V'Chomer. Here we go. So, okay. If you have a davar lo b'kavachomer, can it teach b'gzeira shava? Now, kavachomer. Uma gzeira shava she'eino lemeda be'akesha milamed b'gzeira shava. Kavachomer halamed be'akesh eno din she'telamed b'gzeira shava. Okay, fine. I mean, yeah, without actually thinking about what it actually means, because that'll break the brain, which is already mush. You get the template, right? That if Gzeir Shava is not Lamed Be'akish and it is Melamed B'Gzeir Shava, certainly Kavachomer, which is Lamed Be'akish, is Melamed B'Gzeir Shava. Moving on. Kavachomer. If someone is learned that from Kavachomer, can it be Melamed B'Kavachomer? Once again, Kavachomer. Now, remember I had said earlier that the question of Davlon b'gzeir shava ma'al shilam b'kavachomer, and we said it's a kavachomer, so that's going to be relevant now, because based on the part of the kavachomer that we're going to make now relies upon Davlon b'gzeir shava ma'al b'kavachomer, which itself was only learned via kavachomer. I'm going to take some more water. 1 second. Okay. Where were we? Okay, Davlon b'kavachomer, ma'al shilam b'kavachomer. Kavachomer. Uma gzeira shava she'eino lemeda be'akish midrab Yochanan melamed b'kavachomer kidamar. And as we said earlier, which we only learned from a kavachomer, so this whole kavachomer relies upon an earlier kavachomer. Kavachomer alamed mehakish miditan dever bishmal enudin shilabin v'kavachomer v'zeu kavachomer ben kavachomer. Oh, okay. Again, I'm going to read it now again, but strip out kind of the names so we could just get the structure. Again, Davlamed b'kavachomer, ma'al shilamed b'kavachomer, kavachomer. Uma gzeir shava she'eino lemeda be'akish milamed b'kavachomer. Kavachomer alamed me'akish eno din she'lamed b'kavachomer. Okay, that's fine. V'zeu kavachomer ben kavachomer. This is the kavachomer, the son of a kavachomer, right? Because we just learned the kavachomer, but that kavachomer only works because we only know from an earlier kavachomer. So this is a kavachomer that is the child of a previous kavachomer. Says the Gemara, no, this is not the child of a kavachomer. Ben benoshel kavachomer. It's actually the grandchild of a kavachomer. Kind of the way I've been thinking about this, I can't say I'm totally right, but I hope I'm right. Basically, the point is that the result is right. We're trying to figure out right. If B is learned from A from a kavachomer, can B now teach about C via kavachomer? So that kavachomer from B to C, that kavachomer is learnt out from the kavachomer that we just learned, which is hingent on, I don't know if hingent is a word, but is dependent on the kavachomer from earlier. So basically the result, the kavachomer that is the result, B to C, comes from a kavachomer which relies upon a earlier kavachomer. So basically the resultant kavachomer is a grandchild of that first kavachomer on the top of the Amud from Davlamed b'gzeir shava ma'al shilamed b'kavachomer. Sheesh. El kavachomer. Rather, here's the kavachomer. Umahekish she'eino lamed be'akish imidrav midravina. We'll read it again in a second. Lamed be'kavachomer miditan dever bishmal. Kavachomer lamed be'akish miditan dever bishmal. Enudin she'lamed be'kavachomer v'zeu kavachomer ben kavachomer. Now let's read that again. So a few lines earlier. Ela kavachomer. We're going to strip out the names. Umahekish she'eino lamed be'akish milamed b'kavachomer. Kavachomer halamed me'akish enudin she'lamed b'kavachomer. Okay, zeu kavachomer ben kavachomer, and this is just so the resultant kavachomer is just coming from a kavachomer as opposed to relying upon an earlier kavachomer. So it's the child of a kavachomer, not the grandchild of a kavachomer. Sheesh. Okay, we are done with these tricky kavachomers. Okay, I'm going to drink a little bit more water. Now, says the Gemara, finally, Davar Lomer b'Kal V'chomer, Ma'u Shelamed b'Binyan Av. Okay, if B is learned from A via Kal V'chomer, can it teach about C via Binyan Av? Here we go. Amr B'Yirmiyah says, B'Yirmiyah Toshma, come here. Malak v'nimtzeis treifa. Rameir Omer, Eina mitama b'beis abliya. Reb Yehuda Omer, mitama b'beis abliya. Now, there is a machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda about if you slaughter an animal and it turns out it's a treifa, is it nevela or not? So be'etzem, if you have an animal that just kind of drops dead, let's say, it's a nevela. It's a nevela. It was not slaughtered, it's a nevela. It's an avatuma. If one touches it, so they will be, or it carries it, they will be a rishon l'tumah. So if you have an animal that just drops dead, let's say, so it's an nevela. Or if it was shechted improperly, it's an nevela. An animal that was shechted properly is not a nevela. It's kosher, right? You go to the butcher, you buy some meat. That meat is not tameh, it's tahor. Shechted properly. The question is, what if you slaughter an animal properly, but it turns out that it's a treifa? So, do we treat it like nevela? Do we say, well, it's not a kosher animal, so therefore it's nevela, it's tameh? Or do we say that the fact that it was shechted, that it was a kosher shchita, that was done properly, the shchita was done properly, just turns out the animal's a treifa? Do we say that since it was a kosher shchita, so the animal is tahor? So Reb Meir says the animal is tahor. Reb Yehuda says the animal is nevela, it's tameh. Now, what happens if it is a bird? Now, the halacha is slightly different when it comes to a bird. If you have a bird that drops dead and it's nevela, nivlas, assuming that we're talking about a tahor bird, so there's a halacha that nivlas of tahor is only metame bebeis abliya. That if let's say a chicken drops dead, touching it will not make you tameh. It's not a nevela. It doesn't have tumas nevela at least. Only if you eat it, when you swallow it, will you become tameh. It's metame bebeis abliya. Okay. So now when it comes to birds, so when it comes to, like, let's say a chicken, so what if you slaughter a chicken and it turns out that it's a treifa? So again, Reb Meir would say that it's not metame bebeis abliya, and Reb Yehuda would say that it is metame bebeis abliya. It's nevela. Okay, fine. They say they hold the same way. And not only that, they also hold the same way. It's the same machlokas when it comes to melika. What's melika? Melika is in the Beis Hamikdash, when there was a bird offering. The bird offering would not be slaughtered. Rather, the kohen would take his fingernail, stick it into the back of the neck of the bird, and kill it that way. And that was called melika. And once again, we have the same machlokas of Meir and Reb Yehuda. If it turns out the animal is a treifa, Reb Meir would say that it is not metame bebeis abliya, and Reb Yehuda would say it is metame bebeis abliya. We're going to see in a little bit that Reb Yossi's opinion is kind of somewhere in between, that when it comes to shchita, so shechting the animal, shechting the bird, he would hold like Reb Meir that it is not nevela, but when it comes to melika, he would hold like Reb Yehuda that it is nevela. But anyways, okay. So here we go. Davar Lamed b'Kal V'chomer Mashi Lamed b'Binyan Av. Someone that's learned via Kal V'chomer, can it teach via Binyan Av? Reb Yirmiyah Tashmas is Reb Yirmiyah coming here. Malak v'nimtzeis treifa. So by melika, in the base kohen in the Beis Hamikdash does melika on a bird. Turns out the bird's a treifa. Reb Meir Omer Eina metame bebeis abliya. So Reb Meir says it's not tameh. Obviously you can't eat it, but it's not tameh, because melika was done properly. It is not metame bebeis abliya. Rabbi Yehuda Omer metame bebeis abliya. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says it's nevela. It's a treifa. It's nevela, and it's metame bebeis abliya. Omer Meir Kal V'chomer, and Reb Meir says that, well, listen to this. Listen to the following Kal V'chomer. Uma nivlas behema shemitama b'mago umaz uv'masa. Look, when it comes to a behema, an animal, let's say a sheep, that if it's nevela, it's mitami b'mago uv'masa. If you just touch it, you become tummy. And yet, says Reb Meir, shchitasa mitaheres treifasa mitumasa. And says Reb Meir, look, if you take, let's say, a sheep, which when it's a nevela is stringent, that even if you touch it, you're tummy, and yet, if you had slaughtered it properly, even if it turns out to be a treifa, it is still tahor, because since you did a proper shchita, it is tahor, even though it's a treifa. Well then, nevelas of, when it comes to the nevela of a bird, she'ein mitama b'maga uvamasa, a bird is less stringent than let's say a sheep, because a bird, even if it drops dead and it's a nevela, it's not mitama b'maga uvamasa, only if you then eat it, but it's not, if you touch it, you won't be tummy. So eino din, then certainly shetei shchitasa mitaeres trefasa mitumasa. So certainly then when it comes to a bird, if it was slaughtered properly, and it turns out that the bird is a treifa, it will be tahor. Okay, so we see that a bird is learned from an animal in terms of shchita, making it tahor, even if it's a treifa. And now, mematzinu, binyanav, b'shchita shemachsharta ba'achila, mitaris treifasa mitumasa. So if we see that by shchita, even if it turns out to be a treifa, it's tahora. Af melika shemachsharta ba'achila titari treifasa mitumasa. So I'll say the same thing then also by melika, that even if it turns out to be a treifa, it's still tahor. So we see that Reb Meir learned something from a kal v'chomer, right? Learned the bird being tahor via shchita, even if it's a treifa, from the animal. And then he's learning via binyanav to malika. So we see that Reb Meir is saying that davar lamed b'kal v'chomer choser v'melamed b'binyanav. Now Rabbi Yossi Omer says, Rabbi Yossi Taya kinivlas be'ema Torah sheshchitasa m'tarasa v'lo melikasa. We say, look, says Rabbi Yossi, look, sure, no problem. We can make that gezer, we can make that kal v'chomer from an animal to a bird, right? We say an animal, then it's a treifa. No, an animal when it's an avela, it's mitama b'mago b'masa, and yet a proper shchita would make it tahor even if it's a treifa. Certainly then a bird, which is not mitama b'mago b'masa, shchita would make it tahor even if it's a treifa. But says Rabbi Yossi, we can't learn out anything to malika since we're learning a bird from an animal. There's no malika bichlal by an animal, so therefore there's nothing to learn about malika. If a kohen does malika and the bird turns out to be a treifa, it's going to be tamea according to Rabbi Yossi. But still, the point was that according to Reb Meir, though, we saw that he had no problem saying that davar lamed b'kal v'chomer melamed bebinyanav. To which the Gemara says, Velohi, it's not a good proof. Hasam tavehi mishchita d'chulin ka'asin. The thing is, Cheve, if we're trying to bring this as a proof that davar lamed b'kal v'chomer choser melamed bebinyanav by kodshim, because that was the whole point. Rabbi Yochanan on Daf Mem Tesam and Beis already. Wow, we started on Daf Mem Tesam and Beis already on Daf Nun Aleph Mem Aleph. That if we're saying this within the context of Rabbi Yochanan's statement that ein omrim lamed, ein lamdin lamed min alamed b'kodshim, well, this isn't lamed min alamed b'kodshim because the animal, the bird that we were talking about, those are all chulin. Only once it comes to malika are we talking about kodshim, and therefore we would not consider this lamed min alamed b'kodshim. And now just a final push. I hope it should just take a few minutes. Davar lamed b'binyanav, ma'u shilamed b'hekesh, v'gzer shava, v'kal v'chomer b'binyanav. Has something that's learned out from a binyanav. What about all these hekesh, kal v'chomer, gzer shava, binyanav? Pshot me'ah chadar. Okay. Let's at least just learn one of them, which is Davar Lamed B'Binyan Av, Chozom Lamed B'Binyan Av. Let's see. Mipnei Ma Amru Lun B'Dam Kosher. How come they say that lun, when it comes to blood, is kosher? I think maybe what it means is that if the blood was not thrown on the Mizbeach by Shkia time, I assume, because that's when it needs to be thrown on the Mizbeach by, and then it was thrown on the Mizbeach after Shkia, so you can leave it there. I don't exactly know what it means to not, what would it mean to not leave blood on the Mizbeach? Like you have to wipe it off? I don't know. I don't totally understand this. But anyways, so, how do we know that once you threw this blood on the Mizbeach, you could leave it there? Shari lun be'emurin kosher, because lun by emurim is kosher. That if you didn't burn the emurim, I guess probably by the morning, and then the next day you put it on the Mizbeach, you shouldn't do that obviously, but if you did, you can leave it there. So just like by the emurim you could leave it there, also by the blood you could leave it there. Lun be'emurim kosher, and how do we know that by emurim is kosher? You could just leave it on the Mizbeach if you already put it there. Shari lun be'basar kosher. So this is kind of an interesting one, and the Gemara later on is going to point out that it's kind of weird, but because lun, when it comes to the meat, is permitted. What does that mean? Well, if you have korban shlomim, for example, korban shlomim could be eaten for 2 days, which means that it's obviously resting overnight, right? You slaughtered it on day 1, and comes the next day, you could still eat it. So even though it was lun, even though it went overnight, it's still kosher. So we see essentially Davar Lamed B'Binyan Av, Chozom Lamed B'Binyan Av, right? You have emurin, which is learned out from basar, as just a mematzinu, and now it's teaching about the dam, also by mematzinu, right? So just like lun is kosher by basar, so we'll say, okay, fine, it's also kosher by emurin, and then just like lun is kosher by emurin, we'll say it's also kosher by dam. All right. Now yotze is kosher hovit, yotze kosher bibama. Also a strange one that we'll say that if, let's say emurin, I guess let's say left the azara, but then was burnt on the mizbeach, you could leave it there, because after all, on a bama, right, during a time when you were allowed to make private altars and offer shlomim, let's say in your backyard, so that's entirely happening outside of the azara. So therefore, if let's say the amurim go outside the azara and then somebody puts on the mizbeach, you could leave it there. All right. Tameh, also if I guess the meat got tameh, you could leave it there. Hol v'huter ba'avodas tzibur. No, I'm sorry. Tameh, no, it's not talking about it. It's talking about somebody who's tameh. It's like a tameh kohen, I guess, who put stuff on the mizbeach, you could leave it there, since a tamei kohen would be mutter for communal avoda. Chutz lizmano, if you had, I guess, pigul meat was burnt on the mizbeach, you could leave it there. Hol meratza lefigulo. I think what this means is that since when it comes to pigul, right, even once you had machshav, let's say you slaughter it with machshavas chutz lizmano, we still say that it's at least kosher enough that when you do zrikas adam, it becomes pigul, right? We had discussed the other day that if it was already puzzled, then how could a puzzle zrikas adam affect anything for the korban? So I think the point is that it's like kosher enough to establish it as pigul by zrikas adam. So therefore, also if the meat goes on the mizbeach, you could leave it there. Chutzim komo v'ukosh to chutzim manu. Also chutzim komo, you could leave it if you have meat that had an intention of chutzim komo. Then somebody put it on the mizbeach, you could leave it there because it's compared to chutzim manu. Shekiblo psulin v'zarku daman banach psulin dechazu la'avodas tzibur. Oh no. Oh, oops. When it said tummy earlier, it was talking about tummy parts of the animal. Okay, fine. Now, when it comes to, what would you say? So, shekiblu psulin, if pasul kohanim did kabbalah sadam, vizarku daman, and they did zrika sadam, I guess you could leave the blood there. Be'anach psulin techazul avodas tzibur, we're talking about pasul people that can do avodas tzibur, i.e. kohanim that are tmeim. Okay, fine, great. What was the important thing for us? The important thing was that we were learning the Davar Lamed B'Binyan Av, Chozom Lamed B'Binyan Av, right? When we had the meat and the emurin and the blood. Now, the Gemara says, but some of those examples that we gave were kind of weird. right? Can we learn that something that is not kosher for something that is kosher, right? We're learning that emurim, lun by emurim, you can leave it on the mizbeach, since lun by meat, i.e. like by a korban shlom that you can eat for 2 days, is kosher. Yeah, but by a korban shlom, it's completely kosher to eat for 2 days. How could eating the meat the next day by a korban shlomim, which is completely kosher, have any implication for emurim that were left past their time and they're not kosher? For example, or like we were saying, if it left the azara, it's no problem because if you put it on the mizbeach, because after all, a bama is entirely outside of the mizbeach, but of the azara. But bama by definition is outside of the azara, and that's allowed. Yotze is not allowed. Anyways, Tana mi vizos Torah sa'ola riba. Okay, really that pasuk is, so really we're learning it out is from the pasuk of Zos Torah sa'ola, samich lei, and all these other examples that we're giving, and they kind of like don't necessarily like make sense with the shlomim and the blood and the bama. So it's because that's really just an asmachta. We're not actually learning out from those. Really, it's actually been learned from the pasuk. So to say from earlier that we had this from the meat of the shlomim to the emurim to the dam, that's not really a hard fast kind of drasha, because really it's ultimately being learned out from the pasuk. Chever, that was Daf Nun Aleph of Masechta Zevachim. Shkoyah for hanging in there. So on Daf, did I just say that was Daf Nun Aleph Masechta Zevachim? No, that was Daf Nun of Masechta Zevachim. Though we also learned a chunk from Daf Mem Tes and a chunk from Daf Nun Aleph. But anyways, that was Daf Nun of Masechta Zevachim. Basically, what we did was shish. Of course, right? It was really based on this concept of Reb Yochanan that b'chol haTorah kula lemeidin lamed milamed chutz min hakachim she'ein danin lamed milamed. That by kachim we don't learn out something that's already been learned out, and then we went through hekish, gezer shava, kava chomer, binyanav, and just going through all sorts of manifestations about do we say lamed min lamed or not? Is it an exception to the rule or not? Sheesh, cheve, have a good one. Cheers. And give yourselves a pat on the back too.